Good evening, everybody. This is Rick Richards, and this is the Rick Richards Show, sort of. Going to be doing something a little bit different tonight. I thought we'd all take a break from the COVID news and the current events and all that stuff, and look at something that's a little more abstract, a little more thought-provoking, maybe in some ways. We are filming this late in the evening on April 23rd, 2020. Kind of a different vibe, eh, Ivan?
Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit of a different vibe, a little more relaxed. Probably not going to see a lot of views for this kind of stuff, but I'm going to be doing it anyways, even if only 2 people watch. I am going to start a series of videos called Myth and Metaphor. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at classical myths and sort of unpack them a little bit and, see how they're relevant today, examine the metaphors that are embedded within them, and maybe extract some meaning and maybe get a better understanding of some of these myths. You remember, just probably everybody knows the interesting thing about myths are there are some really sort of grug brain kind of dimwit, low IQ takes on myths, especially religious myths. And people say, "Oh, that obviously didn't happen." Oh, yeah, okay, that's fairly obvious, right? But let's take something. Well, first of all, shout out to the sponsor, right? I got to do that before we get into this, even if there is only 2 people watching, because we got the nighttime vibe, right? Shout out to sponsor Athletic Alliance. God damn, this strawberry lemonade havoc is good. It is really, really good. Shout out to the sponsor Athletic Alliance, available at Popeyes Canada, GNC, right across North America, online at athleticalliance.net. Very soon I will have a coupon code for that, coming to Amazon and SVN Canada as well. Body Energy and a few other places. Fuel. Shout out to, let's see if I can do this off the top of my head. Terry, of course, Richard Rockwell, Dwayne and Charlene, and Cassidy. Cassidy, I remember when she was a little baby. I remember Dwayne telling me about her right when she was born. Actually, even before that, I remember him saying, "Rick, Charlene's pregnant." Dwayne was excited about it back then. You'll be happy to know. Dwayne, Charlene, Cassidy. Let's say Carol, special friend of the show, Lisa, Julia. Although, like I said, I think we'll see a limited audience for this show. So everybody knows the story of Red Riding Hood, right? You know it, right? Shout out to Ivan. Ivan, my man, is here, providing me with company and stats on command. But so when you talk to a little kid, right? Like my littlest daughter's 3. You tell her the story of Red Riding Hood, she's going to take it literally. She's literally going to think that there was a girl walking to her grandmother's house and a wolf got into the grandma's house, ate her, and dressed up like the grandma, right? She'll take that literally. But what is the point of the story? Do you know what the point is of the Red Riding Hood?
Be more careful this game.
Yeah, in a nutshell, be wary of strangers, right? Yeah, that's essentially what it is. It's a tale for children to be wary, right? Because bad stuff can happen to them. So you tell a 3-year-old that, and they really think that, wolves can actually get dressed up in someone's clothing and eat somebody and then hide in their bed, right? But as they get a little bit older, they realize that that can't happen, right? And they think it's just a kid's story or whatever, and they kind of dismiss it. But the fact is, it's a metaphor for what it's an operating system on how people should survive in the world, right? And that's why it lodges in people's brains. That's why it's packaged. See, we tend to think that historically, people that came prior to us were very unsophisticated, very simple, because they didn't have the access to information that we have or the technology. That's not the case, especially when it comes to fables and navigating the survival of their family, of their friends, their circle, their tribe, their group, their nation, right? All of this stuff is designed to help the survival and the prosperity of their particular group. And the stories are very sophisticated, and that's why they're packaged in a way where the story will stay in your mind forever, right? Like we all know Red Riding Hood, and we all remember it, and we all essentially know what it's about, whether or not we believe wolves. And obviously we don't believe wolves can get dressed up in clothing and hide in beds, right? And so, but these same sorts of people, right, they will look at an ancient myth and say, man, those people were stupid back then because they thought there was dragons, right? Or dragons could fly, or dragons could breathe fire and stuff like that. So we are going to explore one of these myths, because today, April 23rd, 2020, is
St. George's Day.
St. George's Day. It is a holiday in England. Let me show you the flag of St. George, just in case you're not aware of what it looks like. There you go. And this is actually the flag of England. It is a red cross on a white background. Many people are familiar with the Union Jack, red, white, and blue, and those crisscrossing pattern. That is the flag of Great Britain. It is the flag of all the combined countries of Great Britain. Wales, Scotland, England, and Northern Ireland. That's all of them combined form the Union Jack. But the actual flag of the country England is this flag here, and the flag of St. George, and it has been for about 900 years. About 900 years. That's a long time, right? From about 1192, I believe, is the actual date. That I'm not completely sure of. Ivan may be able to tell us. But so what is the story of St. George? Okay. Well, I'll give you just a basic rough telling. We'll look at the actual myth itself, and then we'll unpack it, and we'll look at a few of the historical events that support it, and then what the myth is really about. So, St. George. The legend of St. George and the Dragon was first recorded in the 11th century in a Georgian source. It reached Catholic Europe in the 12th century in the Golden Legend. And essentially what it was is George, he was a Roman soldier, right? And he was a Roman soldier, and there was a town or a kingdom in what's in Libya. It's modern day Libya, right? And this town, there was a dragon that was plaguing this town. And so every week or something like that, the dragon would come and it would take 2 sheep. And the people of the town gave the sheep to the dragon. But eventually the dragon started getting greedier and greedier, and sheep weren't enough. He wanted people. So he started taking people, and the town kept sacrificing people to the dragon. And eventually the dragon wanted, or the kingdom would draw lots to see who would get picked to be sacrificed to the dragon. And eventually the king's daughter, the princess, drew the lot. And so it was her turn to be sacrificed. And it was around this time that George showed up, and George fought the dragon, and George slayed the dragon. George slayed the dragon. He killed the dragon, freed the princess, and liberated the kingdom. So that is essentially the myth, right? Well, so what does it really mean? Let's take a deeper look at it. The tradition tells that a fierce dragon was causing panic at the city of Silin, Libya, at the time George arrived there. In order to prevent the dragon from devastating people from the city, they gave 2 sheep each day to the dragon. But each day, I said each week. The sheep were not enough. They were forced to sacrifice humans instead of the 2 sheep. The human to be sacrificed was elected by the city's own people. And at that time, the king's daughter was chosen to be sacrificed, but no one was willing to take her place. George saved the girl by slaying the dragon with a lance. The king was so grateful that he offered him treasures as a reward for saving his daughter's life. But George refused, and instead he gave these to the poor. The people of the city were so amazed at what they had witnessed that they became Christians, and they were all baptized. So the legend, it offers George's encounter with the dragon, and so that's essentially it. Let's now, before we go further, let's take a look at where this legend borrows from. So essentially, this is a Christian myth. And if you look at the time that this not the time when it happened. It was supposed to have happened around the third century, around 300 A.D. Right? That was when the Roman Empire was still kind of definitely in decline, but in a powerful state. It's when Christianity was moving through the empire, and George was an early Christian, I believe, and that sort of gives credence to the whole series of events, right? And we'll take a look at the historical facts that support it in a second. But what's interesting is the 11th century. You have to look at Christianity at the time, right? When myths are developed or perpetuated or enhanced or embodied, they're more a reflection of the people and the time than they are of the actual events. So in the 11th century, or I guess it would be the 12th century, Christianity in England was somewhat insecure. It had only been the dominant religion for most of Europe. I mean, the Roman Empire was primarily Christian by about the 300s, but Northern Europe, 500s, and then right up until about 1000 AD, they had been fighting with Northern Europeans, the pagan Europeans, and forcing them to convert. And it was around this time that Christianity had settled as the dominant religion over all of Europe. By that point, there were no more countries that were primarily pagan, right? And so Christianity was somewhat insecure in that there was not the same sense of myths and legends that those people wanted to hear. There were the stories that had come out of, of the Bible, right? The Bible itself is a series of myths and legends, right? But those people, those pagan people, they didn't, those kind of stories didn't resonate with them to the same degree. They didn't, the water to wine and stuff like that from the Bible. Interesting as it may be, you have to look at the people. And the Northern European people, they held certain values that were not necessarily Christian values, but there were those people's values that they've sort of shoehorned into Christianity. And one of them was bravery, right? So George stands up to a dragon and, he fights the dragon. He shows extreme bravery, and he does it for a woman, right? I mean, this is a common thing in Western civilization that predates Christianity, is doing things for a princess, for an idealized feminine symbol, right? And so Christianity, among those people, there was a plethora of myths and legends, Roman legends, Greek legends, and myths, but none really for Christianity that appealed to that martial sense of honor and valor that was kind of embodied in those Aryan type people, right? And so this was perfect for that, and it was perfect for the time. And Saint George was chosen as the patron saint of England for the simple reason that the King of England, and he was very popular with the knights as well. So let's see some of the other history. Here's some facts and legends around the feast of St. George. Nothing of George's life or deeds can be established, but tradition holds that he was a Roman soldier and was tortured and decapitated under Diocletian's persecution of Christians in 303. So he could kill a dragon, but he couldn't keep his own head, right? Anyways, that's a bit of an aside. He was a warrior saint dating from the 6th century. Legends about him as a warrior saint dating from the 6th century become popular and increasingly extravagant. Jacob de Vauraine's legend Aria, Golden Legend, from 1265 to 1266, repeats the story of his rescuing a Libyan king's daughter from a dragon. And I mean, at that time, you'll hear that George was from Turkey, but at that time, Turkey didn't exist. Turkey was Anatolia, and it was more or less part of Europe. It was a European people living there, as was a European people living in most of Libya. Most of the Goths had come into Libya. And there were some Phoenicians and stuff like that as well. George's slaying of the dragon may be a Christian version of the legend of Perseus. See, this is another thing you'll find throughout Christianity, and that is a lot of the myths and legends have been taken from earlier myths and legends from, say, Apolloism or Hellenic traditions. And one of them is the Greek myth of Perseus and Andromeda. And if you're not sure what that is, a brief overview is Andromeda was the daughter of King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia from Ethiopia. Perseus was a hero who was said to have founded Mycenae. Mycenae is where the Minotaur is. Or, sorry, not the Minotaur, that's Minoa. The Mycenaean kingdom was the kingdom that Agamemnon came from, and the kingdom that fought against Troy, that united. They had the Bronze Age Empire in Greece. And eventually bested the monster Medusa. During his travels, he also crossed paths with Andromeda and saved her life. So basically, Andromeda was a princess, and she was taken by a sea monster, right? So not a dragon, but a sea monster. And he had decided to take the sea monster decided to take a princess instead. And Perseus went there, and he saved her. He rescues Andromeda from Cetus. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of parallels, right? And one of the things we have to look at. Okay, so we know there was no giant sea monster, and we know there was no dragon, right? Right. So I mean, these are metaphors, right? And what does it mean? So this is a classic moralizing tale, right? So essentially, the dragon is a metaphor. It could be a metaphor for Eastern hordes of people like Huns or Mongols. It could be a metaphor for something like plague or something like the coronavirus. It could be a metaphor for pagan religions later on. And essentially, George takes the hero's journey. He's an archetypical hero in that he goes against an overwhelming force, but because he has courage and he has faith and he has pure motives, he is able to overcome that force, right? So essentially, I mean, this means, and if we see the dragon is consuming the resources of the people. So he's consuming the sheep. Sheep are commonly a metaphor for people, right? The flock. You hear them refer to their flock, people as their flock, or a flock of sheep, right? So sheep are the resources of the people, and the dragon could represent a foreign tribe or a foreign race or people that are coming and they're taking people, even a foreign ideology in some cases. And finally, they're taking the king's own daughter himself. So once you take the king's daughter, you're essentially desecrating the kingdom and you're robbing it of its future, right? So that is kind of a boundary that is too far. And we see this as George embodying all the positive qualities of standing up to something that is threatening to destroy a group of people. And essentially, Christianity presents itself as a unifying force, right? A unifying force to stop this sort of persecution, because then they are all baptized. They're all baptized because they're impressed with George's, Christian values and stuff like that, right? So that's what they all are. All these stories are essentially metaphors for how you should conduct your life, right? Or to encourage people or to moralize people. But let's look at the history of George, right? And see if he was in fact a real person and what this stuff was built on. So, what can we find on George? There was an early cult. The veneration of George spread through Syria and Palestine, through Lebanon to the rest of the Byzantine Empire. And again, I mean, these were much more, they were both Semitic and Aryan at the time, in that there was a greater degree of Europeans and Semitic people than there is right now, right? In 494, George was canonized as a saint by Pope Gallus. And what is the actual name for George, or the person that George is based on? George of Lydda. He was a soldier of Cappadocian Greek origins, member of the Praetorian Guard for the Roman Emperor Diocletian, and he was sentenced to death for refusing to recant his Christian faith. So that's probably why they chose him, right? Chose him to be a saint. He became one of the most venerated saints and megalomartyrs in Christianity, and he has been especially venerated as a military saint since the Crusades. England, Ethiopia, and Georgia, and the autonomous communities of Catalonia and Aragon in Spain, and several other nation states, cities, universities, professions, and organizations all claim George as their patron. So that's essentially it. That's George depicted in 1493. George and the Dragon, obviously, is the story that we just retold. There are Muslim legends of George. He's included in some Muslim texts as a prophetic figure. I didn't know that. The Islamic sources state that he lived among a group of believers who were in direct contact with the last apostles of Jesus. He is described as a rich merchant who opposed the erection of Apollo's statue by Mosul's King Dedan. I don't know if I like that. After confronting the king, George was tortured many times to no effect, was imprisoned, and was aided by the angels. Eventually, he exposed that the idols were possessed by Satan, but was martyred when the city was destroyed by God in a rain of fire. Veneration. And now what I say and finally to close off on this, when I say that the saints are more a product of their time than really what they actually did or what they actually represent. Well, this is something we see right now, right? Right now, we don't build up and venerate people that stand up through combat, right? Right now, in our current day, we venerate people that help the suffering or the sick. You can see this with this 7 o'clock clapping for nurses and healthcare workers, right? And banging on pots and pans every evening at 7 o'clock. Because in the current context, those are the people that we frame as martyrs, right? Nelson Mandela is another good example, right? He, in his later years, he kind of switched to a sort of a non-violent, non-terrorist sort of thing. And he was heavily built up in the media, and he's become this kind of icon, right? There's other figures as well. Kobe Bryant could have been there if it wasn't for the COVID-19. He was on his way, funny enough. But yeah, the people that are venerated are more a reflection, more a snapshot of that particular time, right? And then the values are transposed on past generations, as it is with George, right? George is he's a figure that Christians were using in order to cement their rule. One of the most powerful things that there is, more powerful than armies, more powerful than natural disasters, is storytellers. Because storytellers, they affect your collective memory, right? They embody, they communicate your values and your ideals and your aesthetic, and they essentially, they create the operating system for people, if that makes sense. So the storytellers and those that do it have always known it. And those of us that don't realize it are missing out on quite a bit. I mean, we're more influenced today by movies, aren't we, than we are by movies, television, memes. We're more influenced by that than we are by armies, are we not? Or by politicians, right? I mean, that's the power of storytelling. And it's that powerful now. It was even more powerful in the past because there was fewer competing narratives. So if you were able to put out a good myth or a good story, it would be extremely powerful in gathering momentum and being retold and cemented, that sort of thing. So today is St. George's Day. Whether you are a Christian, whether you are Apollonian, whether you are Islamic or Buddhist or whatever, Sikh, that is the story behind St. George and a little bit of the decoding of the myth. So if you find this stuff interesting, let me know. I will see if I can get interviews with people that do a much better job of this than I can. And we will look at exploring a whole bunch of myths and legends and decoding what they really mean and what they were really trying to communicate subconsciously. All right. So for Ivan, I am Rick Richards. That's the Kind of Night, Myth and Metaphor. I will see you probably tomorrow.